Have you ever had one thought that completely changed your mood? Someone doesn't text you back, and suddenly you're thinking, ooh, they must be mad at me. Or you make one mistake at work, and your mind tells you, I am terrible at my job. Or something goes wrong, and you immediately think, of course this happened. Everything always goes wrong for me. These are examples of what psychologists call cognitive distortions. Now, the important thing to understand is that you're having a cognitive distortion does not mean you're irrational, unintelligent, or that something's wrong with you. They're very common patterns in the way our minds interpret information. And in this video, we're going to look at what cognitive distortions are, why our brains use them, and some of the most common ones, and what you can do to recognize one. Let's start with what the term actually means. A cognitive distortion is a predictable pattern of thinking that can influence how we interpret ourselves, other people, and the world around us. The important word here is pattern. A cognitive distortion isn't simply having a negative thought. It's a habitual way of interpreting information that can cause us to see a situation in a more extreme, negative, or inaccurate way. And our thoughts matter because they can influence what we feel and what we do. Something happens, we interpret that something. That interpretation influences our emotions, and those emotions influence our behaviors. Here's where it gets interesting. Imagine you text a friend and they don't respond. The observable fact is pretty simple. They haven't responded. But your brain may immediately fill in the blank, thinking, they're angry at me. I must have done something wrong. They're probably talking about me. Now you're anxious. And because you're anxious, you might send several messages, withdraw from the person, or start replaying your last conversation, trying to figure out what you did wrong. But notice something important. The event itself was simply that your friend didn't respond. Everything after that came from your interpretation of the event. That doesn't mean your interpretation is always wrong. In fact, sometimes it's right. But it does mean we need to learn how to check it to see for sure. One of the most important ideas when we're talking about cognitive distortions is this. A thought is not automatically a fact. They're angry with me is a thought. They haven't responded yet is an observable fact. Those two things are very different. And learning to separate what you know from what you're assuming is one of the most useful skills you can develop. So you might be asking yourself, why do we have cognitive distortions in the first place? Well, it's because our brains are designed to make sense of the world very quickly. We're constantly trying to predict what is going to happen, identify potential threats, recognize patterns, and make decisions with incomplete information. Most of the time, that can be very useful. The problem is that sometimes our brains rely on shortcuts. And when those shortcuts become rigid or extreme, they can lead us toward distorted interpretations. Let's look at some of the most common ones. First off, we have all or nothing thinking. This happens when we see situations in extremes rather than recognizing the middle ground. You're either successful or a failure. Someone either completely supports you or they're against you. You either did something perfectly or you completely failed. Real life usually contains a lot more gray than that. Another common distortion is catastrophizing. This is when our minds jump toward the worst possible outcome and then treat the outcome as though it is inevitable. Maybe you have to give a presentation. You think, what if I mess this up? Then your mind jumps to, everyone will notice, everyone will remember, I'll embarrass myself, I'll never be able to face them again. Notice how quickly the thought moves from a possibility to a complete disaster. Next up, let's talk about mind reading. Mind reading is when we assume that we know what another person is thinking or feeling without proper evidence. Someone looks at you differently and you think, they're annoyed with me. Someone doesn't respond enthusiastically and you think, they don't like me. Someone gives you feedback and you think, oh, they think I'm incompetent. The problem is that we're treating an assumption as though it's information. Fortune telling is up next. Fortune telling is similar, but instead of assuming we know what someone else is thinking, we're assuming we know what will happen in the future. I'm going to fail. They're going to reject me. This isn't going to work. Of course, sometimes our predictions turn out to be accurate. The distortion is treating an uncertain future as though the outcome is already determined. Overgeneralization. Overgeneralization happens when we take one experience and use it to make a much broader conclusion. You fail a test and you think, I am terrible at school. Someone rejects you and you think, nobody will ever want me. You make a mistake and you think, I always screw things up. Look for words like always, never, everyone, and nobody. They're not automatically distortions, but they can be clues that your thinking may be becoming overly broad. Now let's talk about mental filtering. A mental filter happens when we focus heavily on one negative part of an experience while filtering out everything else. Imagine you have a presentation and 9 things go well, but you stumble over one sentence. You go home and spend the rest of the night thinking about that one sentence, that one mistake, and nothing else. Your brain has filtered out the 9 things that went well and zoomed in on the one thing that didn't. How about personalization? Personalization is when we automatically assume that something is about us or was caused by us when there may be other explanations. Your friend seems quiet and you immediately think, "Ooh, I must have done something." Your coworker seems irritated and you think, they're obviously upset with me. But there may be dozens of explanations that have nothing to do with you. Personalization can make us carry responsibility for things that actually is not ours to carry. Now let's talk about emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning happens when we treat our emotional experience as proof of an external reality. I feel like a failure, so I must be a failure. I feel unsafe, so I must be in danger. I feel like nobody likes me, so nobody likes me. Your feelings are real, but feelings don't always provide an accurate measurement of the situation. And this is where we get to the part that I think is most useful. How to challenge a cognitive distortion. The goal isn't to force yourself to think positively. Instead, we want to think more accurately. Start by identifying the thought. Then ask yourself, what are the actual facts? What am I assuming? Is there another explanation? And finally, ask yourself, what would I say to someone I care about if they were having this same thought? That last question can be surprisingly powerful because we're often much more balanced when we're talking to someone else than when we're talking to ourselves. Now, let's take our original example. The distorted thought was, they didn't respond to me. They must be angry with me. Checking the facts might sound like this. I don't actually know why they haven't responded. And the balanced thought might be, there could be several explanations. I'll wait for more information. Notice that we didn't replace the negative thought with something unrealistic, like, oh, they definitely love me. Everything's fine. We're simply moving from an assumption to a more accurate interpretation. Now, this is really important. Cognitive restructuring is not about convincing yourself that everything is wonderful. That is a distortion in itself. It's not about ignoring legitimate problems. It's not about replacing every negative thought with a positive one. The goal is a more accurate, flexible, and balanced thinking. Sometimes the accurate thought is still difficult, but it's different from automatically assuming the worst. If you remember one thing from this presentation, I want you to remember this. Your thoughts deserve examination. Not every thought deserves to be believed. A thought can feel incredibly convincing and still be an assumption, an interpretation, or a distorted view of reality. You don't have to argue with every thought that enters your mind. Sometimes you simply need to pause and ask, is this a fact, or is this a story my mind is telling me? Cognitive distortions are something most of us experience from time to time. The goal is not to completely eliminate them. The goal is to become better at recognizing them when they show up, check the evidence, consider other explanations, and choose a more balanced way of looking at the situation. The next time you notice yourself thinking, they hate me, I'm a failure, this is going to be a disaster, or this always happens to me, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what do I actually know? And then ask, what am I assuming? That small pause can create a lot more room between what happened and how you respond. I'm Daniel, and this is The Quiet Mind. If you found it helpful, subscribe for more videos where we break down mental health concepts in a practical, understandable, and clinically informed way. I look forward to catching you in the next one.